Hello and welcome to Gaspar's History Podcast and the stories of the Meat Hound, the 306 Bomb Group, and the young men and women woven into the history of this adventure. Our last mission took us back to March 28, 1943, and was what the heroes of our story called a milk run. And it was written after I found something while looking for something else. The episode opened with a letter that Tech Sergeant Leon Bamforth sent home to his mom in December of 1942. The letter reminded us of just how precious and desired the littlest of luxuries were, and how easy it was to forget the difference between the haves and the have-nots. The episode closed with our flyers feeling the physical and mental strains of combat, where some of them were literally hanging on by a thread. Today's story will once again highlight Tech Sergeant Leon Bamforth, who will captivate you as he shields the Meat Hound and her crew from the misguided hunters in their multicolored flying circus butcher birds. The mission today takes place on April 4th, 1943. The Meat Hound and the Steele crew take a trip to the Renault factory and works at Biel & Co., where they will leave their calling card as a reminder that the debt of freedom has yet to be paid. This episode will require you to keep your head on a swivel, and there will be a Wilhelmshaven deja vu attack, not to mention the sighting of a flying zebra. Let's dig into this action-packed episode where hopefully we can connect you to your history. I remember my first trip to the Normandy Museum in Caen with my uncle Jean-Claude, who was captain of the frigate in Ouistreham. We spent hours in the museum, and if you're not into museums, then it is probably best that you were not there, because he and I gave that place a good perusing. Why do I bring this up? Because the museum in Caen has a display that is tied to our story, one of the most powerful historical messages, and clearly the most memorable exhibit of the day. You see, there was this brick wall with bullet holes in it from the Nazi firing squad that executed a young Frenchman who was caught posting anti-Nazi literature. Apparently, the penalty for posting anti-Nazi literature was death. As a young college student, I stood there, staring at the wall, the posted literature, the bullet holes, and wondered why and how. And thank God there were no Nazis on my college campus, because if there were, I think the university would be expunged of protesters. They were not really protesters, but rather students who were not afraid to post and share their thoughts, comments, or beliefs. I have a solid example that is not appropriate for this podcast, so let me know if you want to hear it. But all of that is to say, a young Frenchman posting a bill because he is tired of the Nazis and their occupation. Then, when he is caught, the ruling, the judgment, the end is a firing squad. Quite sad indeed. The French citizens were under the control of the Nazis, and the Nazis were exercising their will over them. The French citizens had no rights over the Germans, so the French began their resistance, the formal act of defiance, and they became a real thorn in the Nazi side. As we have discussed in other episodes, the French resistance and underground had an elaborate network to help get our flyers back to England after they had been shot down and evaded capture. But integral to our story today were the French citizens that collaborated with the Germans. French collaborators were viewed as traitors, and the disdain for collaborators was on par, if not greater, than that of the Nazis. On this cloudy Sunday morning, the Meat Hound would soon be on her way to bomb the Renault manufacturing plant and operations in the suburbs of Paris. Was the famous car manufacturer Louis Renault a collaborator? Because Renault's manufacturing facilities were producing war machines for the Nazis, Renault was not alone. There were other French manufacturing companies doing the same. With that said, it is fair to say that Renault was a collaborator, but again, he was not alone. However, the everlasting argument is, but to what degree, and for what purpose? After the war, the French government seized control of Renault's factories, and the company was nationalized. The French government decided they would take control of Renault's company. In more modern recent history, the Renault family has filed lawsuits to get the company back, and they have argued about the legality of the original seizure. With that, we will continue our story, but if you are interested, there are books, references, and lawsuits to pursue that you will most likely find most satisfying as it relates to Louis Renault and the level of collaboration and the family's battle nearly 80 years later to get it back. Nearly 80 years. Wow. The flyers were up early, before dawn, as usual. Steele and the Meat Hound crew were tapped on the shoulder. You're up, you're flying. It was never easy getting up early, and each man was driven by something different. But the most common response was duty. Duty carries a heavy yoke. It's an obligation, a commitment, and a lot of times may not even be your will. We may argue that these volunteers, being volunteers, accepted their duty and sought it out. Even if that is true, the root cause of that commitment to duty was not of their own accord, but rather laid at their feet due to the actions of others and the enslavement of half of Europe. The 306 Bomb Group briefing room was standing room only. It was a large crowd this morning, so I wonder what was up. The blue tarp hung in her usual spot, and the room was loud. There had never been this many flyers in the room before, and it looked like it was going to be the biggest mission we've ever had. Holy crap, what if we're going to Berlin? The usual bets were placed, prayers were said, and the senior officers entered the room, and the rabble came to attention. Colonel Putnam was on the podium and revealed Beale & Co., specifically the Renault manufacturing facilities and operations. The crews were not expecting it, but there were a few I knew it. The bomb group had had a rough mission to Paris in December of 1942. And even though that was nearly 4 months ago, it still had a little sting to it. And for those who were around back then, they wondered how many of their friends had survived. The mission was maximum effort, with all 4 of the 306 squadrons flying a full squadron. All 4 squadrons must have meant this was a special mission. In a lot of ways, it was a special mission. The 306th was going to put 30 aircraft in the air today. 30. Do you remember when they were trying to get 12 aircraft on a mission? This takes us back to episode 4, I Thought You Were Dead. This was the mission where the Unbearable had a mechanical issue and could not fly, so Captain Brady secured a replacement aircraft along with Gardner Reynolds, the Steele crew bombardier, and they tried to catch up to the bomb group. However, by the time the 306th was near the French coast, they had less than the required 12 aircraft, so Major Wilson turned the bomb group around and went back to Thurley. Captain Brady, he was unaware of the 306th decision to turn around, and he ended up catching up and attaching to the 305th Bomb Group, where, after the bomb run and on their return trip, they were jumped at Brest and shot down. Second Lieutenant Gardner Reynolds was the only survivor, and was captured at a coastal lighthouse, freezing and without his shoes. You see, our story is progressing, and we are learning about the evolution of the 8th Air Force and the unescorted bombing missions of late 1942 into the first half of 1943. The aircraft, men, and equipment of the 8th Air Force continues to grow at an exponential rate. Whole bomb groups are being added, and the 306th Bomb Group, who just a few months earlier was trying to get 12 aircraft on a mission, are setting the standard for all the bomb groups and will put 30 aircraft in the air to start the mission, and they will have 27 aircraft over the target. I would have said 27 will bomb the target, but you'll have to wait and see. The group huddle ended, the crews went to their respective breakout sessions. They picked up their emergency kits, finished getting dressed, and headed for their planes. The airfield was abuzz. Literally, the ground crews had once again been up all night, adjusting engines, fixing cables. The armorers were trying to load 6 1,000-pound bombs on 30 aircraft in one night. The armorers were also loading 50 caliber machine gun ammunition, enough for a minimum of 12 guns on 30 aircraft. You can imagine the buzz, the chatter, the cursing, and the like. Steele and Jones arrived at the Meat Hound, and introductions occurred. Steele was the assigned pilot, and Lieutenant Jones was the co-pilot. This would be Steele's 10th mission and Jones's 12th. The Steele crew are flying aircraft 42, 29, 524, the Meat Hound in her magnificent glory. Her determined scowl, focused eyes, and pointed ears attested to her commitment and her drive. This would be the Meat Hound's 4th mission, and to date she had only suffered minor battle damage, but had been quite problematic when it came to electric suits and the interphone. She was under the same fate as her crew. The odds of her finishing 25 missions was stacked against her. In fact, there are a couple of famous aircraft working their way to 25 missions, and one of them would become arguably one of the most famous aircraft that ever existed. Isn't it sad that you can name that aircraft, but you can't name the first flyer to complete 25 missions? The Steele crew, it still has a nice name to it. They had gathered at the Meat Hound, and she watched as they went through introductions, because it was standard practice to have a new guy on the aircraft, because the new guys were arriving at a pretty regular pace. 2 new members, Steele announced. Lieutenant James Cheney is navigating, and Sergeant Frank Porcelli is on the left waist gun. Welcome. Lieutenant Cheney arriving this morning, so help him out. He just arrived. He will get us home when we need him. Lieutenant, you are in good hands in the nose. Staff Sergeant Hull is toggling and is a marksman on the Brownings. Don't worry, he always looks that way, but he might smile if he can knock a Jerry out of the sky. Lieutenant James Cheney was originally from Arizona, but had graduated high school in Jacksonville, Florida. Sergeant Porcelli, you may be comforted to know that Sergeant Stokowski has been up in the Meat Hound and with her and is familiar with her. Tech Sergeant Bamforth is engineering today, and Tech Sergeant Stymax is on the wireless. This would be Tech Sergeant Bamforth's 9th mission. The ball turret gun was manned by the ever-reliable Staff Sergeant Piotrowski, and the rearview mirror was manned by Staff Sergeant Smoot. The rearview mirror is the tail gun position, and as I said, the right waist gun is being manned by Sergeant Stokowski, who is back with us for another mission. It was a good crew on a good plane. The Meat Hound was in good hands, and she would need them today. Steele reminded the crew that 20 squadrons of Spitfires were flying protection. There were no snide comments, at least out loud, but everyone was thinking, except for the new guys, if we see them. Steele was thinking back to his first mission, his near-death experience, and how the new guys are going to be coming back, eyes wide open, if of course they do indeed come back at all. The second wing, consisting of 25 B-24s, were flying the diversion today, so hopefully that takes a little pressure off of us. But Jerry is smart and probably already knows we are coming. Watch your oxygen, keep your gloves on, and keep your heads on a swivel. We are going after the Renault factory at Biel-Loncourt, which is making tanks and trucks for the Nazis. So Sergeant, looking at Hall, let's see if we can't shut them down for a while. Steele, looking at Smoot, Sergeant, let us know what you are seeing. The sergeant responded with, yes, sir. Okay, let's load up and good luck. With that, the Steele crew scrambled into the Meat Hound, checked their equipment, and prepared for takeoff. Steele and Jones went through the checklist. Always the checklist. It was critical, and then the startup. The Meat Hound's Wright Cyclone engines were humming this morning and sounded good. The ground crew should be complimented. It was just before 11 a.m., and the 30 aircraft of the 306 Bomb Group started to get into the air, and then they headed towards Beachy Head, which I still think sounds like a wonderful place. The ultimate formation is a bit of a mess due to the number of aircraft and the small piece of paper that it was captured on. Plus, there would be 3 aborts and some shoring up to fly tight, so the exact positions are somewhat of a mystery. Steele and Jones were very cognizant of tight formation flying, and Jones has made several comments about not wanting to be yelled at for flying loose. It was a large formation, the largest to date, so it had its challenges. Sergeant Smoot continued to provide the pilots updates on their position and formation. The Meat Hound climbed to 24,000 feet, nearly 5 miles above the earth. The crew went on oxygen at 10,000 feet, and the Meat Hound's guns were tested and declared operational. Now that they were on oxygen, Lieutenant Jones was maintaining crew contacts on the interphone, but Sergeant Piotrowski in the ball turret gun was not responding. Sergeant Stokowski had to check on him and reported that his interphone was out. Lieutenant Jones asked the sergeant to continue to make checks on Piotrowski to make sure he was okay. What a lonely position to be in, separated by the ball turret, rolled up in a ball, and now without anyone to talk to. Today, his guns would do the talking. As they crossed into France, the Meat Hound's big, focused eyes saw no signs of the normal Luftwaffe greeting, and she was pleased. She was flying the number 2 position in the lead element on the right high side in echelon of the 423rd Squadron. Steele and Jones had her tight on the right side of Captain Smith and Roy Kelly, who were flying the DFC and leading the 423rd Squadron. The number 3 in this lead element was being flown by Lieutenant Johnson and Lieutenant Bart Wigington, Steele's good friend and the overall nice guy of the squadron. Johnson and Wigington were flying 42-29-649, a no-named F-Beauty that had just come into the 306th the last week of March, and in a month will be engaged in one of the greatest stories of all time, and will be one of the few B-17s that has the pleasure of completing a Medal of Honor mission. The second element of the 423rd Squadron was flying echelon right and was on the far right side of the bomb group. The second element was led by Captain Urey and Lieutenant Sugg in 42-5714 Old Faithful. On their right, and holding the right side of the high formation, is Lieutenant Warren George and Lieutenant Robert Oscar Malin in their no-named F-Beauty 42-5171. And then on their left is Scarlet in 42 5720, being flown by Lieutenants O'Hara and Robert Smith. The 423rd Squadron had 2 additional planes in the formation today. Captain Check and Lieutenant Cassidy were leading an element that was flying in the slot, and they were flying the Skywolf 425218, who is putting together a nice little career, which is an opportunity for me to once again call out the mechanics and the support crews, like Sergeant Ben Marcellus, who is credited with designing a flak helmet that the gunners and crew members could actually see out of and still be protected. Doesn't it seem only logical to have a helmet that protects you from flak and you can also see out of it? Interesting. Lastly, Lieutenants Hopkins and Pip were in 425784, a no-named F-Beauty, and they attached to Captain Bucky's element, who was also flying in a slot position of one of the other squadrons. The 423rd Squadron had 8 aircraft on the mission, and they cruised their way into France. Tech Sergeant Leon Bamforth was a calming presence behind Steele and Jones. Leon's knowledge of automobile engines and mechanics served him well in his engineering role. The flight engineer was to know the workings of the B-17 better than any other crew member. Tech Sergeant Bamforth would stand behind the pilots during most of the mission, helping to manage the dials, gauges, and engines. He would leave them once enemy aircraft were spotted, when he would assume his role as the top turret gunner. One of the engineer's primary duties was to manage the fuel consumption and thereby manage the flow of the 100-octane aircraft fuel to the appropriate engines. The Meat Hound was a handful and required a team all working together to get her up, defended, and home safely. This is one interesting fact of this series, is how rarely the same flyers are flying together mission after mission. That meant each airman could and would step into a role and do their job. Let's chat a little bit about the Meat Hound's fuel system and possibly some things that you may not have known, but something that Tech Sergeant Bamforth knew like the back of his hand. Did you know that the fuel for the B-17F was stored in her wings? On longer missions, 2 additional fuel tanks in the bomb bay could also be filled. The number 1 and number 4 engines had 425-gallon tanks. The number 2 and the number 3 engines had 213-gallon tanks. There were then 2 feeder tanks, one for the number 2 engine and one for the number 3 engine, each with 212-gallon tanks. Then there was an outboard wing tank for number 1 engine and the number 4 engine, and they each held 270 gallons each. Then an inboard wing tank for the number 2 and the number 3 engines that held an additional 270 gallons. That means the B-17F could carry 2,780 gallons of fuel. Then, when we add the 2 tanks in the bomb bay, we get an additional 820 gallons of fuel. That's a lot of fuel. The outer wing feeder tanks were made up of 9 individual collapsible self-sealing cells called Tokyo tanks, and the fuel system also contained an automatic fuel shutoff switch to stop the flow of fuel in case of a severed fuel line. Good thing, because 100-octane fuel will light up fast. Self-sealing fuel tanks were very important. The fuel tanks in the U.S. fighters and bombers were constructed with 6 layers that helped the fuel tank self-seal if it were penetrated by flak or machine gun fire. The outer layer was an abrasive fabric nitrile. Then came a layer of rubber sealant. Then a layer of rayon. Then another rubber sealant layer. And finally, closest to the fuel, was another nitrile rubber layer. However, self-sealing tanks was not always the case, and there were some early versions of the B-17 that did not have self-sealing tanks. No thank you is all I have to say. So how did this work? The tanks were about 0.3 inches thick. If the fuel tank was penetrated, and let me assure you they were, the 100 octane fuel came in contact with the rubber sealant layers, which caused those layers to rapidly expand through some kind of voodoo, magical, scientific power, which then sealed the hole. Plugged it like the hole in your tire of your car, only your car tire was not leaking 100 octane flammable liquid. This ingenuity greatly reduced the number of explosions after an aircraft was damaged. Pretty smart, right? It was not foolproof, but it did save countless lives. The Meat Hound did not need any extra fuel today, so Tech Sergeant Bamforth was dealing with a normal fuel load. Bamforth was studying the gauges, his eyes shifting from one to another like clockwork, instinctively knowing where to look next. The Meat Hound's crew were on oxygen nearly 5 miles above the ground, and Lieutenant Jones asked for the crew to check in and confirm that Walt is still with us. Sergeant Piotrowski is the Meat Hound's ball turret gunner, you know, the one without a working interphone, and he is still conscious. The Luftwaffe radar stations lit up like the 4th of July. The once mighty aggressor found himself playing more and more defense. There were bombers everywhere, or at least that was what the radar was leading them to believe. Maybe the British were dropping aluminum chaff again. It was not always easy to tell the difference, but quick calls to the field would confirm yay or nay on the sighting of contrails and the legitimacy of the radar contact. Think about the mass geography we are talking about. The Allied bomb groups are threatening from Norway to France. That is a lot of space to defend. The Nazis have a well-entrenched spy network, and loose lips sink ships. As good as the intelligence network was, it seems they were not exactly sure where the real target was today, and as a result, they fell for a feint. And just like me in fencing, the result was the attack scored a touche. Our stories are real, and the decisions that were made on each of these days by each of these leaders, flyers, and ground crews had consequences. Sometimes the results of those consequences were eternal. This was not a game or a movie. So what do you think it was like for the 44th Bomb Group? You know, the B-24 Liberators, known as the Flying 8 Balls? What do you think it was like for them to be a decoy, a pawn, bait? I'm sure on the outside, they said it was our duty and they welcomed the challenge. But on the inside, they realized their life, their future, their family, their value was to draw an enemy towards them so others may fly in less peril. How would you feel about being the bait? The Flying 8 Balls played the role of the rabbit on this day, and the fox went after her until he realized he'd been duped. Once the Luftwaffe realized they had gone after the feint, they recalled their foxes and had them refuel while the 85 aircraft of the 91st, 303rd, 305th, and 306th bomb groups went unassailed to Paris. Jerry was pissed. The Renault factory was a grand multi-building complex. On one side of the Seine was the Caudron Renault aircraft factory, and on the other side of the bend in the river was the Renault Motor Works. The Meat Hound was rapidly approaching Paris, and not one yellow-nosed bastard was in sight. The flak was light, so she was approaching the bomb run in a perfect storm. The crew knew that meant it would be a dogfight home, except for the new guys. They thought this was easy. It was just after 1400 hours and the 3 minutes of death that the 85 B-17s were going to unleash was quickly approaching. The air raid sirens alerted civilians and the foes that a formation of bombers was nearby, but what was their target? Maybe they were on their way to Villacoublay, or maybe the large multi-building complex of the Renault factories. It did not matter. One needed to find shelter, because let's be honest, when the bombs left the B-17, there really was no guarantee where they were going to land. How terrifying was a bomb run on the soldiers and the civilians down below? Think of this as you sip your mocha grand latte, just like me, except tonight it's Turkish coffee. The 4 bomb groups, 85 aircraft, would fly over the target and drop 502, yes, 502 1,000-pound bombs over a 3-minute period. I remember Hank Sobel of the 2nd Ranger Battalion telling me what it was like as they were getting shelled by German artillery on Hill 400. He said it was the worst feeling possible. You were helpless. You just tried to lay as flat as you could to the ground. The ground on Hill 400 was frozen, so it was impossible to dig a foxhole. But once the shelling had stopped, he said, there were lots of foxholes, but less than 20 D Company Rangers left to fight. Heading 190 degrees, sir, Lieutenant Cheney called out. Pretty exciting for day 1, don't you think? And so far, it's been smooth sailing. The flak started to intensify with large black crashes filling the cloudy blue skies. Lieutenant Cheney could see the greeting to Paris out the nose of the Meat Hound. The explosions were large and black. The Meat Hound, with her focused eyes, barked back. It's a little light today, Lieutenant. We got this. Staff Sergeant Hull was eyeing 42-5306, waiting for her to drop the eggs, as they would say. His hand was on the toggle switch, waiting to turn from off to on, which would then release the 6 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs from the racks. Tech Sergeant Bamforth was hoping the racks would release the bombs because it was never any fun climbing into the bomb rack and kicking them out, which was one of his jobs if something went awry. The flak continued, and it was accurate in both height and direction, so it looked like the 306th was going to have a bouncy bomb run. The next 30 seconds would take them through their target. I remember a story told to me by my French uncle, Jean-Claude. He shared with me an incident that he remembered as a child in Normandy. He and his father were walking down a dirt road when an Allied fighter plane made a strafing machine gun attack on them. His father grabbed him, jumped into the ditch on the side of the road, evading the attack and saving their lives. He told me, some 45 years later, how his father explained to him that that was the price of freedom. I do not suppose that every French citizen felt that way when errant bombs killed friends or family, or fighters strafing was done on them, but I am sure that they knew these actions were the result of their occupation. The Renault factories were surrounded by general population centers. This was a factory producing materials and goods for the Nazis, and the factory owner, Louis Renault, would be charged with collaboration and have his factories nationalized after the war. Today's bombing results would certainly carry with it years of emotion and pain. It also makes me wonder, as a genealogist, how many family names and lineages came to an end today. All of my comments and wonders are also based on the bombing results, which you will hear, where it was actually touted as some of the most accurate and successful so far in the war, which then begs the question, I wonder what the results of the other missions had, even if the crews were not supposed to bomb indiscriminately in France. Once again, the 306th was sandwiched in the semi-protective center of the plane parade. The lead bomber group started to release their bombs on the target, and the Meat Hound could see the crashes and the shock waves pound the earth from 24,000 feet. The Meat Hound was holding her heading at 190 degrees, nearly coming through the target from north to south. She was on the far right of the aircraft, holding the right flank of the bomb group's formation, with our friends Lieutenant George and Lieutenant Malin and the no-named F-Beauty truly on the flank. I call this out because some of the bombs do reach some residential communities, but it looks like physics would prevent that from occurring from the Meat Hound or George and Malin. Colonel Putnam had Captain Yalsey in the bombardier's position. He was the bomb group's lead bombardier. He had control of the plane and had the Norden bomb sight on target, and flipped his bomb release switch only for it not to work. You can imagine the panic he was in as the lead targeter and the focus for which the togglers would have a watchful eye. Nothing happened. The release trigger didn't work. The mission report would state, under the crew injuries sections of the report, there were no crew injuries, but Yalsey's feelings were hurt when his release trigger didn't work. Bombs salvoed. Bombs started to leave the 306th aircraft, and the Meat Hound followed. Staff Sergeant Hull had a good release trigger switch today, and Tech Sergeant Bamforth was not going to have to kick the bombs out of the bomb racks. Bombs away was the call from Staff Sergeant Hull, and he followed the bombs down to the earth where the 6 1,000-pound bombs crashed in the target area, presumably that being the Renault repair shop, power plant, forges, and cylinder block machine shop. As Staff Sergeant Hull reported, all were in the target area. Lieutenant Cheney had a chance to peek out the nose and watch the bombs land on the target. It was quite a sight. Lieutenants Johnson and Wigington reported bombs in the target area and one on the island. Hell of a good job. Captain Check and Lieutenant Cassidy reported plenty of direct hits. Lieutenants George and Malin reported their bombs on this side of the river and only 3 or 4 on the other side. Lieutenant O'Hara and the Scarlet, they reported the squadron hit the target beautifully. The 306 were through their 30 seconds of bombing and were banking for their vector home. Lieutenant Steele held the Meat Hound in position, and Lieutenant Jones called out to the crew to be on high alert, and Staff Sergeant Piotrowski once again was checked on. Tech Sergeant Bamforth from his top turret gun position could see the flak continue to crash around the Meat Hound, but it was nothing like their old friend at Saint Nazaire. The last of the bomb groups were through the target, and the 3 minutes of hell for those on the ground would continue, even though the bombs had stopped falling. At some point, one of the aircraft or squadrons hit the north of the side of the target in the Longchamp, Racecourse, and Pont de Serennes communities, and when they did, it killed the 66-year-old famous composer Raoul Lamparra, who had composed the opera La Habanera. Lamparra was one of the 327 French men, women, and children that were killed that day. There was an additional 1,500 people wounded on this mission. It does make me wonder how the price of freedom and liberty may ebb and flow on any given day, sans real debate over the necessity to pay it. Tech Sergeant Bamforth had control of the Meat Hound's defense. The crew were chatting it up, and there was confidence for the new gunner, Sergeant Porcelli as he stood freezing by his waist gun position, protecting the interior side of the Meat Hound on her journey home. The Renault factory works had been smashed, and these results would get touted and used for propaganda through numerous publications over the next year. The Luftwaffe had swung and missed. Now she was coming back up, well armed, fully fueled, and being led by some of her most famous pilots and aces of the war. The life and death struggle that was happening in and around the Renault Motor Works would now work its way into the skies 24,000 feet above the earth, all the way back to England. The Luftwaffe records note that the Renault Motor Works was within JG-2's operating territory, but they never made an interception that day. They also note that the 305th was the lead bomb group of the day, so maybe that's true, as I did not see it listed in the 8th Air Force records. The Luftwaffe records do call out the next phase of our story, and that is that JG-26 launched a maximum effort attack on the bomb groups as the bomb groups headed for Rouen. The JG-26 yellow-nosed bastards had launched from Vitry, Lille, Abbeville, and Velhingen, which was in Belgium. Luftwaffe aircraft number 2392, piloted by Karl Fackler, was a radial-nosed Focke-Wulf A4. He took off from the Vitry on Artois airfield and quickly climbed to altitude with the rest of the 2nd Group 6 Staffel. The 2nd Group commander for the day was Captain Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the younger brother of Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, who at the end of the war would organize the Luftwaffe jet fighters. The Meat Hound had wreaked havoc on the Renault factory, and Steele had her tight in formation and banked her out of town, staying echeloned right and high as they headed for Rouen. It is in one's nature to punch it, Maud, and make a beeline for home. Steele so wished they were going faster so he could get to the fighter protection at Rouen. That is, of course, if the fighter protection was there, or even if the fighters could find them. Lieutenant Jones was managing the engines and barked out for all the gunners to be at their posts, because even though one may want to book at home, the B-17's best defense was to be a pack, as she was not built for speed. The Meat Hound was under 30 minutes to Rouen and at cruising speed. Jones called out for an update and status, and Steele wanted to know what Staff Sergeant Smoot was seeing. Staff Sergeant Smoot called it out. Bandits, bandits, everywhere, 6 o'clock high. Everyone's head was on a swivel. Stokowski reminded Porcelli to lead his shots. The 423rd Squadron gunners en masse were calling out the bandits. Captain Yuri's crew was reporting 50 to 60. Captain Czech was saying it's more like 60 to 70. George and Malin were reporting 45 to 50. In the Meat Hound, she was reporting 30. The enemy aircraft were primarily Focke-Wulf 190s, but let's be fair, this was a Luftwaffe maximum effort, so anything that had guns and could fly was in the air. Tech Sergeant Bamforth was snug in his top turret and was rotating his turret to see if he could tell where the first attack was going to come from. His duties had shifted from chief engineer to chief defensive gunner. Captain of the defense, you might say. Can you imagine what it must be like to see a horde of enemy aircraft preparing to attack? 6 is scary, but 60 is very concerning. Leon's Sperry turret was a sophisticated piece of equipment, especially for 1943. Tech Sergeant Bamforth had a youthful look, a charming smile, and a non-threatening presence. But once he got strapped into his Sperry top turret gun position, he was a killer, like so many young men who had just a couple of years before been in high school. Now, he was responsible for a 4-engine bomber, and over the next hour, he was responsible for protecting that bomber and his fellow crew members. Here they come, and the radios and interphones were lit up with "Here Comes Jerry," "Bandit," 3 o'clock high, "Bandit," 7 o'clock low, "Bandit," 12 o'clock high, "Watch out, get him, Leon." "Here comes one, Smoot calls him out. Walt, can you pick him up?" Everyone but the pilots were on a gun, even Stymax in the radio room. Leon's hands in his thick gloves were wrapped around the handlebars, and the kill switch was depressed. The Sperry top turret gun was powered by an electric hydraulic motor and could turn 360 degrees and included an auto shut-off mechanism, so Leon did not shoot off the tail of the aircraft with the twin Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns. Tech Sergeant Bamforth was well versed in the workings of his gun system and had dialed in the 34-foot wingspan of the Focke-Wulf 190, which would be the Meat Hound's main adversary for the day. Leon adjusted his optical sights to account for the sun, and he continued to rotate his guns, looking for a target and waiting for an attack. 85 US B-17 bombers were headed for Rouen, and the 70 or so Luftwaffe hunters had arrived on the scene, and the battle commenced. Giddy up. The 2nd Squadron, or Staffel, of Luftwaffe JG-26 had selected the 8th Air Force, 306 Bomb Group, 423rd Bomb Squadron for their attack. Feldwebel Sergeant Karl Fackler was behind and a little higher than the 423rd Squadron when he throttled up his BMW radial engine and nosed down, trying to decide which of the 6 bombers on the high right side of the formation he was going to shoot down. The sergeant's gun sight in the Focke-Wulf A4 was on the right side of the cockpit, and his gun sight system was illuminated as he dove on his selected prey, the Meat Hound. "Bandit, 6 o'clock high. Bandit, 6 o'clock high." The call came over the interphone. Sergeant Smoot, from his rear view, could see the attack commence. The Meat Hound's crew were in their position. What happens next transpires in less than a minute. Lieutenant Steele and Jones were in concert with Captain Smith and Lieutenant Johnson as their evasions began. Lieutenant, or I should say, Leon, had a very good view of the distant Focke-Wulf, as she seemed to be focused on the Meat Hound, but he could see no cannon fire from her wings. But Lieutenant Steele could see the 20mm shells exploding out the left side of his window, so they were coming from somewhere, but remember, there was a lot of aircraft in the air. Sergeant Fackler was comforted by the fact that he was not alone in his attack this afternoon. He also knew the B-17 was a bit of a porcupine, and the trick was to not get stuck by one of the 13 Browning 50 caliber machine guns the Meat Hound was equipped with. He was still a little out of range for his 20mm cannons, so he would wait a bit longer before he pushed the button and the auto-loading cannons would start their distinctive blam, blam, blam. Sergeant Smoot was anxious and on the interphone. "Bandit, bandit, 6 o'clock high." He was very clear this radial-nosed bastard was coming in quickly. Tech Sergeant Leon Bamforth had a good view of the Focke-Wulf 190 and her cowling. He used his handlebar grips to dial in the range, 1,000 yards, so his Sperry K3 gun sight would cipher proper distance and deflection. You know, deflection, the arc on the bullet, so at a certain distance, 2 objects will meet. Tech Sergeant Bamforth started firing at 1,000 yards. He was certainly at distance, but he knew others had downed enemy aircraft that far away. He was dialed in calm, and continued to sharpen his sights as Sergeant Fackler continued to press forward. He gained speed and placed the Meat Hound in his sights, but he held his fire just a bit longer. The Focke-Wulf 190 was inside 1,000 yards and closing fast when Sergeant Fackler could see, feel, and hear the 50 caliber bullets penetrating into his aircraft. It was the most horrific of sounds as the aluminum, steel, and lead crashed into each other. He needed to get that B-17 gunner off of him, so he pressed the button, and the autocannons and machine guns started a concert of fire, and the Meat Hound maneuvered. Tech Sergeant Bamforth once again re-engaged his fire, which was finding its mark and peppering the Focke-Wulf as the distance closed and the Focke-Wulf returned fire. The whole squadron was being attacked. Staff Sergeant Smoot was reporting more enemy aircraft off the 6 o'clock position. The Meat Hound's waist gunners, Stokowski and Porcelli, joined in the fight as the Luftwaffe aircraft came within range, but only one was focused on the Meat Hound. Sergeant Fackler was trying to destroy the Meat Hound, but his 20mm cannons continued to miss their mark. But it only took one well-placed round in the fuel cell or the cockpit to bring down his foe. His cannon fire missed again as Steele maneuvered her ever so precisely. The Meat Hound's machine guns were ablaze, and the interphone was becoming a bit of a confused mess. Within seconds, the Focke-Wulf had closed within 6 football fields of the Meat Hound, and Tech Sergeant Leon Bamforth's guns were dead on. The armored, piercing 50 caliber rounds ripped through the engine block, which started a fire. The fire quickly spread, fueled by the aviation fuel and oxygen. The right wing became engulfed, and armor-piercing rounds, 11 per second, shredded the Focke-Wulf 190 as the fire quickly engulfed the fuselage. There is no evidence at this point in the flight that Sergeant Fackler had been wounded or killed, since his aircraft continued to fly in a smooth line, diving on the Meat Hound. Therefore, I have to believe once the fuselage had been engulfed in flames, he would have tried to escape out of the canopy. But then, aircraft number 2392, a Focke-Wulf 190A4, exploded in the most violent fashion, and the aircraft was instantly disintegrated as pieces and parts of her were spread through the sky. There simply was nothing left of the aircraft. The Meat Hound's interphone was abuzz. "You got him, Leon," came the congratulatory calls from Tech Sergeant Stymax and Staff Sergeant Smoot. "Nice shooting. Did you see her explode? It went everywhere." The pilots joined in the congratulations, but Lieutenant Jones sharply reminded everyone to stay on their guns, but he did not need to, as it looked like an angry wasp nest out there. B-17 gunners often talked about how scared they were, but once the combat started, they did not have time to think about anything else but fighting. I know Tech Sergeant Bamforth was sweating at 24,000 feet, and for a moment felt relief. But that was just a moment, because "Here they come" was the call over the interphone, and the Meat Hound's guns once again erupted in concert. Sergeant Smoot called it in, bandits, 6 o'clock level. He was the only one that had a shot. That was until they passed, climbed, or dove past the Meat Hound. These Focke-Wulf 190s, and there were several of them to attack, came in on the tail of the squadron from level positions, picking on the right side aircraft 42, 51, 71 with our friends Lieutenant Warren George and Second Lieutenant Robert Malin. Also in the aircraft, Second Lieutenant Simmons was the navigator. Second Lieutenant Lucas was the bombardier. Tech Sergeant Thornton was the radio gunner. Tech Sergeant McGregor was the engineer. Staff Sergeant McLennan was the ball turret gunner. And the infamous Staff Sergeant Don Bevan was on the right waist. And Staff Sergeant Dykovich was on the left waist. And in the rear was Staff Sergeant Lamb. A pack of red-finned Focke Wolves focused on George and Malin's 42-5171, the no-named F-Beauty that we've come to love. Lieutenant George went into evasive action, but it was not enough, as the right wing took several hits. The number 3 engine started to smoke. Second Lieutenant Malin had a great look at it. It was just outside his window. How bad is it? Bad. Tech Sergeant McGregor, the engineer, was too busy on his top turret guns to provide any assistance. The engine started to smoke, heavy black smoke, which was like blood in the water. Malin watched as the oil pressure started to drop rapidly. Then the pressure was completely gone. The pilot shut down the engine. They turned off the battery. They feathered the propeller. It reduced the drag, but it wasn't enough. They started to fall behind, and they were smoking. Staff Sergeants Lamb and Bevan, they were experienced, and they had been credited with kills, so they were coaching the others up as the shell casings started to pile up in the floor of the no-named F-Beauty. The good news was no one was wounded or killed, and they were still flying. The bad news was they were about to get picked on. Staff Sergeant Smoot could see George and Malin had been hit. Damn. Sir, George and Malin have been hit, and they're falling behind. They're also smoking pretty bad, and the number 3 engine is out. This was a message no one wanted to get, especially when they are your friends. Staff Sergeant Lamb, from his tailgun position in Lieutenant George's aircraft, calmly called it out again. Bandits, bandits, 530 level. Sergeant Bevan did not have a shot, and he wondered if this was it. Staff Sergeant McLennan, in his ball turret, was not quite able to get the right deflection on them, so it was all on Sergeant Lamb. He picked a Focke-Wulf 190 with some brightly colored red markings and started to fire at the rapidly approaching aircraft. The Focke-Wulf's pilot exchanged pleasantries. Staff Sergeant Lamb could see the flashes from the Focke-Wulf 190, and he kept his fingers on the lever as he went through 75 rounds of ammunition. Lieutenant George continued to evade while trying to stay as close as he could to the rest of the squadron, but the no-named F-Beauty continued to lag behind. They were slowly losing cross-protection from both Captain Urey in Hustle and Sue and Lieutenant O'Hara in Scarlet. Staff Sergeant Lamb's 75-round burst hit the red Focke-Wulf that shredded the right wing of the aircraft, and it gave way while Sergeant Lamb watched the wing collapse, folding up, then bursting into flames, and the aircraft headed for the earth with no parachute spotted. The Grim Reapers now had a wounded bird that they needed to get home, and they were still too far away from their fighter protection at Rouen. The no-named F-Beauty 42-5171 then lost the supercharger in her number 2 engine, so she was now down on power at altitude. Lieutenant George continued to evade while Malin adjusted the manifold pressure, as they were going to have to go to emergency power. Bandits, 3 o'clock low. Staff Sergeant Bevan alerted the crew, and Staff Sergeant McLennan spun his ball turret to 3 o'clock and jumped into the defense. The Bandit was a uniquely colored Focke-Wulf 190, coming in fast, preparing a turn to rake the no-named F-Beauty from bow to stern. On the Meat Hound, Staff Sergeant Stokowski called in the attack, as he could see the Bandit picking on the no-named F-Beauty, but there was little he could do to support it. Bandits at 3 o'clock level. There were more coming, and the Meat Hound too was under attack. Heads were on swivels, and this was some of the most fierce combat the crews had ever seen. Staff Sergeant McLennan, in Lieutenant George's no-named F-Beauty, was in one of the most iconic and storied combat positions of the war, the main feature of the B-17, even if the position was the most uncomfortable and lonely. But this ball turret was just a little different. This no-named F-Beauty had been installed with the English sights. I'm going to be honest, I have no idea what English sights are, and when I ran this by the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson last week, they said they had heard of English sights, but they couldn't tell me exactly what they were either. So anyway, Staff Sergeant McLennan followed the Focke-Wulf 190 and anticipated her angle of pursuit, and then he pulled his handles, and the twin Browning machine guns responded with violence. The staff sergeant kept firing. At least 150 rounds left the ball turret guns, and he watched as the Focke-Wulf lit up on fire, engulfing the aircraft at a high rate of speed as more bullets tore through the fuselage and the enemy's aircraft quickly nosed down, which was a good indication the pilot had been killed. Staff Sergeant McLennan with the rest of the no-named F-Beauty crew watched as the aircraft fell to the earth, burning from nose to tip, and the once brightly colored aircraft was now a charred mess. Once again, the 42-5171 had survived another attack, just like the rest of the Grim Reapers. She had 2 confirmed kills, but would she make it home to tell these stories? Second Lieutenant Malin was adjusting the engines to give her everything she had, and they were hoping the cavalry was on the way. Our story is building to an epic ending, one that Hollywood, YouTubers, podcasters, and authors all love to illustrate. It was one with epic aircraft and famous pilots. It is one that history is made of. It was a combat scene built for those with attention deficit disorder, a fast battle where at the end, one was asking themselves, what just happened? The 306 Bomb Group was flying 27 aircraft, more than any other bomb group to date in the war. There were 10 crew members per aircraft, so that is 270 crew members. They were flying the Curtis LeMay high, middle, low at 150 miles per hour. There were 3 other bomb groups with 58 aircraft. You heard me say it earlier. The Luftwaffe had sent up a horde of fighters at 350 miles an hour to attack the bombers, and they had all met up just outside of Paris. This running battle was then interrupted by scores of Spitfire escorts at 350 miles an hour that culminated in an aerial ballet of life and death. Our story now moves into a vision of that ballet as reported by some of the airmen of the 306 Bomb Group. The view from the Meat Hound was like none other, as one of the largest groups of B-17s to date were racing for England at a steady and determined pace. It was easy for the pilots and crews to get distracted. It was easy to wander, but Steele and Jones and the other pilots all remained focused while their minds raced and their eyes watered. Jones was on the interphone to the crew, reminding them of what they did not need to be reminded of. The swarms of Luftwaffe fighters were easily recognized as Sergeants Stokowski and Porcelli stood in their freezing waist gun positions, wondering where the next attack would come from. The Luftwaffe were relentless, and they were attacking from every angle and height. They were simply taking advantage of every opportunity while also trying to create new ones. They were not waiting to get ahead of the bombers to make a head-on attack. They were attacking at will while the Spitfires were racing to the rescue. Staff Sergeant Hull with Lieutenant Cheney, the first-timer, were in the nose of the Meat Hound and could see a B-17 from the group ahead going down in flames, which was always hard to watch. They watched as 2 chutes came out, only to be disappointed when they saw no more. Lieutenant Cheney noted it in the logbook, then stood beside his gun. It did not take long for Lieutenant Cheney to make a second recording as the Meat Hound watched another B-17 head for the earth in a ball of flames. It was hard to watch indeed, and if the Meat Hound had tears, she certainly would have shed one. Those poor B-17s in the cruise had fallen to some of Luftwaffe's best, Galland and Boris. The 306th was coming into Rouen airspace, and they were expecting fighter support to arrive at any time. The Meat Hound had escaped damage, but Steele and Jones knew they were going to be in a fight all the way across the channel, whether they had fighter support or not. Leon Bamforth did not bother to use the strap seat in his top turret gun position. He liked to move. He liked to be on his feet for stability. From his position, he had a great view similar to the pilots, but he could rotate 360 degrees when he needed to. The Meat Hound was approaching Rouen when more fighters appeared on the horizon. They were both friend and foe. The fact was, the Meat Hound and the 306 had been under constant attack since leaving Paris. They were simply entering the next stage of the fight. The Spitfire squadrons were always a welcome sight. The cavalry had arrived, but they too were welcomed by the Luftwaffe and Galland himself. A very large dogfight commenced. The large number of fighters in the skies was causing identification issues with the 306th nervous gunners, not to mention all the first-timers in the lot of 270. It seems everyone started shooting at any perceived threat. The Spitfire fighters came straight in, and the Grim Reapers of the 423rd Squadron were taken back and immediately felt threatened, since it was obvious the squadrons were coming in fast and direct. It looked like a Luftwaffe attack. Lieutenant George and Second Lieutenant Malin, along with Lieutenant Simmons and Lieutenant Lucas, were chatting it up, trying to figure out if they were really friendly Spitfires, but they also knew they were trailing the pack and figured the Spits were coming in aggressive to help save the day. Staff Sergeant Dajkovic from his left waist gun position called in on the interphone that the Scarlet on their left was firing at the Spitfires and wanted confirmation that they were Spitfires. "Hold your fire, gunners, hold your fire." The crescendo continued to build as the Meat Hound's crew and the no-named F-Beauty of George and Malin witnessed 2 large explosions on the B-17 bomb group ahead of them. They had seen this before, but now they were wiser, and they immediately logged the result as a bomb attack on the bombers. Tech Sergeant Leon Bamforth and Staff Sergeant Hull witnessed large black smoke balls erupting in front of them after a couple of Focke-Wulfs made dive bomb attacks on the bomb groups ahead of them, either the 303rd or the 305th. The sky was a melee, and Staff Sergeant Hull, along with Steele and Jones, watched as another B-17 from the group in front of them fell out of the sky as the result of fighter attacks, not the bombing. 2 chutes left the aircraft, and then she started to burn uncontrollably on her way to the earth. Steele was thinking to himself, "It is a wonder how anyone has survived this bloody mess." Lieutenant Cheney made a 3rd note in the logbook, and the battle raged on. The Meat Hound's waist gunners, Sergeants Stokowski and Porcelli, were fast at work, standing side by side, one looking out the right of the fuselage, one looking out the left. The Meat Hound had been made with the waist gun openings cut at the same point in the fuselage, and it was times like this that the design was not the best, as they were literally running into each other when attacks were coming from both sides at the same time. The spent shell casings were piling up in the Meat Hound's floor, but there was no gun malfunctions or no ammo chute jams. The Meat Hound was in good order, other than her interphone. No need to check on Piotrowski. We can hear his guns firing. "What is that?" called out the Skywolf's crew. A Focke-Wulf with British markings on her just flew by, and the circus and fog of war continued. Captain Chick's crew followed the bandit as the Focke-Wulf was on their 4 o'clock. They watched as a British Spitfire said, "Not so fast, my well-disguised friend," and attacked the Focke-Wulf from behind, and the Skywolf watched as the tail of the Focke-Wulf separated from the aircraft, and she spun 24,000 feet to her demise. What an oddity, and no explanation of what was going on. The Grim Reapers were now reporting several other Luftwaffe aircraft painted in Spitfire patterns, but what was making things worse was they were actually flying the Spitfire thatch weave tactics. Sergeant Stokowski from his right waist gun called out a bandit. Sergeant Stokowski from his right waist gun called out a bandit at 3 o'clock high and diving. He's on the right side. He opened fire with his machine gun, and the distinctive burst from the Browning machine gun could be heard through the Meat Hound. The Me-109 raced through the bomb group formation with lightning speed. "Did you see that?" "I did," said Porcelli. "It looked like a zebra. That aircraft was painted like a zebra." The Spitfires were now providing enough of a distraction that the pressure on the bombers started to ease. They had reached the English Channel, and Lieutenants George and Malin in 42-5171 were still with them. In fact, the 306th was intact as the bomb group started to cross the channel. Colonel Putnam was bringing the bomb group back to Thurley. Lieutenants McGoffin and Conley in 9629 were coming home with 20mm burst holes along the side of the aircraft. Lieutenant Selos in 631 was going to need a new tail. Lieutenant Reber and Second Lieutenant Barnes, they had the number 4 prop shot up. Holes in the motor, one tire shot out, and a big hole in the left wing, and the elevators had been shot out. Lieutenants George and Malin, they were coming home with a shot-out engine, but the rest of the bomb group's battle damage was nominal. The Meat Hound would report no battle damage, just a bad interphone. The Luftwaffe would claim 8 Spitfires. Lieutenant Miller's aircraft 643 of the 368 Squadron did witness and log one of the Spitfires going down in a spin just off of the coast. No other crews reported seeing a Spitfire go down, but just about everyone in the 306th recorded the 3 B-17s going down. The 42-5171 landed safely, and the crew made their way into the debriefing room, knowing they were lucky. The S-2 that greeted them this day was none other than Captain Barnes' father. Captain Barnes' father was English and did work with the U.S. bomb groups collecting data after missions. Why do I call out Captain Barnes' father? Well, he's a famous illustrator from World War I, an English version of Kilroy, you might say. You should check his illustrations out and just think of the things you may find when you're looking for something else. This was a 5-hour and 15-minute mission for the Meat Hound and crew, and by the time they landed, they were nearly out of oxygen on the aircraft. They had better get that sorted because there are going to be longer missions, and the enemy will certainly punch holes in the tanks, so one is going to need all the backup they can get. They had their coffee and Spam sandwiches and walked through the events with the S-2. They described the B-17s that they saw going down, the number of parachutes that they saw. They described the flak all along the route, its color and accuracy. They described their bomb run and where their bombs had landed and where they saw other bombs landing. They described the enemy aircraft, count, types, and markings. They then shared the specific details of Focke-Wulf 190's dive bombing the bomb group ahead of them. Then they got to promote Tech Sergeant Leon Bamforth's kill. Leon shared his story while Staff Sergeant Smoot and Tech Sergeant Stymax confirmed his story, which was documented as a certain destroyed. The newbies got the full experience, and Lieutenant Cheney, well, he would go on to become the 423rd Group Navigator, but he started his European tour as the navigator on the Meat Hound. The briefing room was full of excitement and relief. You can imagine what it is like to have young men full of piss and vinegar come off of a life and death mission and now get to tell their stories. Their faces were exaggerated. Their hands recreated enemy aircraft. They illustrated how they got to the tail gunners who had passed out due to lack of oxygen, how they kept checking on crew members without an interphone, and how they moved and fired when the enemy attacks occurred. All told with smiles and excitement, except for the accounts of the crews that went down and the counting of the parachutes. On this particular day, there was a little more excitement. Not only had they also witnessed the Focke-Wulf 190 dive bombing attacks, but Lieutenant Miller in 368 Squadron in Aircraft 42 29643 commented that the 91st Bomb Group, who was trailing the 306, had crowded them again and dropped their bombs through the 306th formation. Just so you know, the Memphis Belle was not one of them, as she was not flying today. Captain Smiley of the 368th Squadron in Aircraft 41 24466 confirmed the story, reporting the same incident. This is now a second report where the 91st had either flown into or now over the 306th, so I wonder what their conversations at the pub were like. Lieutenant David Steele was relieved. It was another successful mission. Remember, successful mission means everyone came home. He had completed his 10th mission, and 25 felt like it was too far away, so all he could do was live and pray. He was thinking about his leave to London in mid-March and how those flannel sheets were so nice, but so expensive, so he would have to settle for his bunk, wondering if he was going to get tapped on the shoulder because there was a very important mission scheduled for tomorrow. He would. This concludes episode 14, Full House to Paris. Our next mission will begin on the very next day, April 5th, 1943, which is a very somber day for the bomb group. In fact, we are coming into somber season for the bomb group and the 423rd Squadron. I continue to find things while looking for something else, and I am continuously reminded that one must ask questions while the owners of the information are still alive. You must ask for stories while they can still tell them. Remember that our family and veterans do not write all of their stories or memories down. In fact, they're probably suppressed, and you will not find, and they will not find their way to the surface unless we gently nudge them that way. Therefore, go find your history and your connection to it, and just think of the things you may find when you're looking for something else. Gaspar, out.